The Sterling estate was not a home. It was a fortress of silence. Perched on a cliffside overlooking the churning Atlantic in Newport, Rhode Island, the mansion was a masterpiece of cold, white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. To the world, it was the seat of power for Silas Sterling, the 38-year-old titan of global logistics. Silas was a man who moved the world's goods, but he let very little move his heart. Silas was a creature of absolute precision. He woke at 4:30 a.m., ran 10 miles on a silent treadmill, and consumed a breakfast of black coffee and protein that tasted of nothing. He spoke in clipped sentences, his eyes always fixed on the glowing data of his monitors. He had no wife, no children, and no friends. Only associates who feared his intellect and subordinates who trembled at his silence. To Silas, the people who maintained his life, the drivers, the chefs, the security teams, were merely biological extensions of his machinery. They were meant to be efficient, punctual, and above all, invisible. The new domestic assistant started today, Mr. Sterling. His chief of staff, Harrison, mentioned during the morning briefing. Silas didn't look up from his quarterly projections. Is the coffee at 175 degrees? Yes, sir. Then her name is irrelevant. Ensure she stays out of my line of sight. That irrelevant name was Elena Vance. Elena was 24, with quiet gray eyes and hands that bore the faint scars of a life lived in the margins. She had grown up in the foster care system of Appalachia, moving from one broken home to another, until she learned that the best way to survive was to become a shadow. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. Shadows were rarely hurt. Her job at the Sterling estate was grueling. She was tasked with the deep cleaning, the tasks even the regular staff avoided. She polished the silver in the dead of night, scrubbed the grout of the expansive wine cellar, and dusted the thousands of books in Silas's private library, a room Silas himself rarely entered, preferring digital data over paper history. Silas Sterling had a secret, one that sat like a lead weight in the center of his chest. It was the reason for his insomnia, the reason for his coldness, and the reason he had built a glass fortress where no one could get close. In the center of his library, hidden behind a false panel of leather-bound encyclopedias, was a safe. Inside that safe was not money or jewels, but a weathered blue velvet box containing a single tarnished brass key and a handwritten letter from 20 years ago. The letter was from his father, the man whose empire Silas had inherited and expanded with ruthless efficiency. The secret was simple. The Sterling fortune was built on a lie. His father hadn't been a visionary. He had been a thief. He had stolen the patents for a revolutionary tracking system from his best friend, a man named Arthur Vance, who had died in poverty and disgrace while the Sterlings climbed to the clouds. Silas had discovered this truth 6 months ago while auditing old family archives. Since then, the glass walls of his life had started to feel like a prison. He felt like a squatter in his own kingdom. Every dollar he earned felt like blood money. But his pride, the Sterling pride, wouldn't allow him to confess. He was the logistics king. If the world knew the truth, the empire would collapse, and Silas would be nothing. One Tuesday at 3 a.m., Silas found himself wandering the library. His insomnia was particularly sharp, a jagged edge cutting through his mind. He reached for the false panel, needing to touch the blue velvet box, to punish himself with the weight of his father's sin. He opened the safe, pulled out the box, and sat at the massive oak desk. He didn't turn on the lights, preferring the moonlight that bled through the high windows. It's a heavy burden, isn't it? Carrying something that doesn't belong to you. The voice was soft, melodic, and came from the darkest corner of the room. Silas froze. His hand instinctively covered the box. "Who's there?" A figure emerged from the shadows near the tall mahogany shelves. She was wearing a simple gray uniform, a damp cloth in her hand. Elena. She had been dusting the upper ledges, perched on a rolling ladder, hidden by the gloom. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling," Elena said, her voice steady despite the power dynamic. "I didn't mean to intrude. I am invisible, remember?" Silas stood up, his stature imposing. "You are fired. Pack your things and leave. No one enters this room when I am in the house." Elena didn't move. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him with a strange, piercing empathy. "You can fire me, sir, but you can't fire the truth. I've been cleaning this room for 3 weeks. I've seen you come in here every night. I've seen the way you look at that box. You look at it the way my father used to look at the sky before he died. Like you're waiting for a storm to wash you away." Silas's breath hitched. "You know nothing of my life." "I know that people who have nothing to hide don't sit in the dark with brass keys," she whispered. "How do you know it's a key?" Silas snapped. Elena stepped into the moonlight. For the first time, Silas truly saw her. She wasn't just a maid. She was a witness. "Because I have the lock it fits," she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small circular locket, tarnished and old. She opened it to reveal a tiny faded photograph of a man with brilliant, kind eyes. Silas stared at the photo. He recognized those eyes from the old company portraits. It was Arthur Vance. "My name is Elena Vance," she said, her voice finally trembling. "And I didn't take this job for the salary, Mr. Sterling. I took it because I wanted to see the man who lives in the house built on my father's grave." The silence that followed was so profound it felt like the ocean itself had stopped breathing. The logistics king and the invisible maid stood in the moonlight, the secret finally out in the open, hanging between them like a bared blade. The air in the library felt as though it had been vacuum sealed. Silas Sterling, a man who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers without blinking, felt his knees grow weak. He looked from the tarnished locket in Elena's hand to the blue velvet box on his desk. The mathematical probability of this encounter was astronomical. Yet here she was, the living consequence of his family's greed. "You," Silas started, his voice a dry rasp. "You are Arthur's daughter." "His youngest," Elena replied, her gaze never wavering. "He died when I was 5. He spent his final years in a cramped apartment in Pittsburgh, scribbling diagrams on napkins, telling anyone who would listen that his friend had taken his soul. People called him a dreamer. Some called him a madman. I just called him Daddy." Silas sank back into his leather chair. The cold, calculating CEO was gone. In his place was a man being crushed by the architecture of his own life. "I only found out 6 months ago," he whispered, gesturing to the safe. "The records were buried in a private vault in Switzerland. My father. He didn't just take the patents. He blackmailed the legal team to ensure your father could never sue." "I know," Elena said softly, stepping closer to the desk. "I didn't come here for revenge, Silas. I didn't come here to sue you, or to leak this to the press. If I wanted to destroy you, I would have done it from the outside." "Then why?" Silas demanded, a flicker of his old defensiveness returning. "Why scrub my floors? Why watch me suffer in the dark?" "Because I wanted to know if you were like him," she said. "I wanted to see if the logistics king was just another thief, or if he was a man trapped by a legacy he never asked for. For 3 weeks I've watched you. I've seen you skip meals. I've seen you stare at the ocean as if you were waiting for it to swallow you. You aren't happy, Silas. You're haunted. Silas let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Happiness is a luxury I surrendered the day I took over this company. I have 20,000 employees. I have global supply chains that keep nations fed. If I admit the truth, the lawsuits will tear Sterling Global apart. Thousands of families will lose their livelihoods. My father's sin has become the foundation of too many lives. I am a prisoner of too big to fail. Elena looked around the room, at the gold-leafed books and the priceless art. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That you're a martyr for your employees? You aren't protecting them, Silas. You're protecting the Sterling name. You're protecting the mirror. Silas stood up, his temper flaring. You speak with the privilege of someone who has nothing to lose. I am the one holding the world on my shoulders. And how is that working for you? Elena asked, her voice calm and cutting. You have everything, and yet you are the loneliest man I have ever met. You live in a glass house, but you've painted the windows black. She turned to leave, but Silas's voice stopped her. What do you want, Elena? Money? I can write a check right now that will make you richer than you ever dreamed. I can buy back your father's dignity with $1 billion. Elena stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. You can't buy dignity, Silas. That's the billionaire's mistake. You can only earn it. My father didn't die wanting money. He died wanting to be seen. He wanted the world to know he mattered. You're the only one who can give him that now. She disappeared into the hallway, leaving Silas alone in the silence. The next few days were a blur of agonizing routine. Silas tried to focus on a massive merger with a European rail giant, but every time he looked at a contract, he saw Arthur Vance's eyes. Every time he drank his perfectly heated coffee, he thought of Elena scrubbing the floors in the middle of the night, of Vance serving a Sterling. He began to watch her. Not as a ghost, but as a person. He noticed the way she hummed while she worked, a soft, melancholic tune. He noticed that she moved with a grace that the marble floors didn't deserve. On Friday night, Silas did something he had never done. He cancelled his executive dinner and went to the staff quarters. The security team was baffled as he pushed past them, heading for the humble wing at the back of the estate. He found Elena in the small communal garden, sitting on a wooden bench, looking at the stars. The rail merger is finalized, he said, standing behind her. Congratulations, she replied without turning. Does it make the weight lighter? No, Silas admitted. He sat down on the edge of the bench, his expensive suit looking out of place against the weathered wood. I've spent my whole life being the smartest person in the room. But I don't know how to fix this, Elena. If I go public, the company dies. If I stay silent, I die. There is a third way, Elena said, turning to look at him. But it requires you to stop being a king and start being a human. My father's secret isn't just about a patent. It was about a vision. He wanted to create a system that didn't just track goods, but protected people. A safety net for the small players. Your father turned it into a weapon for the big ones. The Vance Protocol, Silas whispered, remembering the name in the files. It was designed for humanitarian aid, wasn't it? Yes, Elena said. It could revolutionize how we get medicine to the parts of the world your company ignores, because there's no profit there. If you implement it, if you give him the credit, you don't have to destroy the company. You can transform it. Silas looked at her, the moonlight reflecting in his eyes. For the first time, he didn't see an invisible maid. He saw a partner. He saw a way out of the dark. But as they sat there, a flash went off from the bushes. Silas jumped up, his executive instincts screaming, Who's there?" A man in a dark jacket scrambled over the garden wall, a long-lens camera in his hand. It was a tabloid photographer. "Silas Sterling in the servant quarters with a maid!" the man shouted as he ran toward a waiting car. "The logistics king has a secret lover. This is going to be the headline of the century." Silas turned to Elena, his face pale. The secret was about to come out, but not in the way they had planned. The world wouldn't see a story of redemption. They would see a scandal. And in the world of high finance, a scandal was just as deadly as a crime. "Elena," Silas said, the panic rising, "if they dig into who you are, if they connect you to Arthur, it's over." "No," Elena said, her gray eyes steady. "It's just beginning." The flash of the camera lens felt like a gunshot in the quiet sanctuary of the garden. By the next morning, the glass fortress of the Sterling estate was under siege. Silas stood in his command center, the walls of monitors now displaying not logistics data, but a feed of tabloid headlines and social media frenzies. "The king and the cleaner," screamed one. "Sterling's secret garden affair," mocked another. Harrison, his chief of staff, was pacing the marble floor, his phone buzzing incessantly. "The board is panicking, Silas. The stock has dipped 4 points in pre-market trading. The European rail partners are asking if this distraction will affect the merger. They want a statement. They want the girl gone." "She's not a distraction, Harrison," Silas said, his voice deceptively quiet. He was looking at a grainy photo of himself sitting on the bench next to Elena. In the photo, he didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked like a man seeking air. "Then what is she?" Harrison demanded. "Silas, you've never had a scandal. If you don't fire her and issue a denial immediately, the vultures will start circling. They'll look into her background. They'll find out she's a Vance." Silas turned, his eyes icy. "Let them look. Maybe it's time they found something real." In the servant quarters, Elena was not hiding. She was methodically folding her gray uniform, placing it into a small, worn suitcase. She knew how the world worked. She knew that when a king was threatened, the shadows were the first to be burned. The door opened, and Silas stepped in. It was the first time he had entered a room in his own house that wasn't designed to impress. The ceiling was low, the furniture functional. "You're leaving," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "I'm a liability now," Elena replied, not looking up. "The photographers are at the gates. If I stay, I become the story. If I leave, you can bury it." "I don't want to bury it anymore, Elena." Elena finally looked at him. "You have a $1 billion merger on the table, Silas. You have a legacy to protect." "A legacy of theft?" Silas stepped closer. "Last night after you left, I went back to the safe. I read my father's letter again. He wrote that his greatest regret wasn't the money he stole, but that he eventually started believing his own lies. He forgot who he was before the marble and the glass." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. "The Vance Protocol is more than a humanitarian tool. It's the original code for our entire tracking infrastructure. If I implement it, I have to admit the source. I have to admit that Sterling Global is built on Vance architecture." "They will sue you for everything," Elena whispered. "The shareholders will revolt." "Let them," Silas said. "I've spent my life moving boxes around the world, making sure they arrive on time. But I never cared what was inside them. I want to build something that matters. But I can't do it alone. I need the person who knows the vision better than I do." He held out the key to her. "Don't leave as a maid, Elena. Stay as the director of the Vance Foundation. We'll announce the merger and the restitution at the same time. We'll tell the truth." Elena looked at the key, then at the man holding it. The Logistics King was offering to dismantle his crown. But before she could answer, the room's intercom barked to life. "Mr. Sterling!" Harrison's voice sounded frantic. "The chairman of the board is here. He's brought the lawyers. They've seen the background check on Elena Vance. They know who she is, Silas. They're calling it a conspiracy. They think she's blackmailing you." Silas's face hardened. The board wasn't just worried about a scandal. They were worried about their own pockets. If Silas admitted to the theft of the patents, the board members could be held liable for decades of ill-gotten gains. "Stay here," Silas told Elena. "Don't open the door for anyone." Silas walked into the main drawing room. The chairman, a man named Sterling's uncle, Arthur's former rival, was waiting. Beside him stood 3 men in charcoal suits, the cleaners of the corporate world. "Sit down, Silas," the chairman said. "We've handled the situation. The girl will be charged with industrial espionage and extortion. We have a paper trail, fabricated, of course, that shows she stole files from your library." Silas felt a cold fury settle in his bones. You would destroy an innocent woman to protect a lie? "We are protecting the company, Silas. Your father did what he had to do to build this." "We won't let a house girl and your sudden midlife crisis tear it down. Sign these papers. They state that you were a victim of her manipulation. She'll go to prison for 5 years. The press will move on, and the merger will proceed." Silas looked at the papers. They were a map back to his old life. High-speed treadmills, black coffee, and a heart of marble. "And if I refuse?" The chairman leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "Then we remove you for incompetence. We'll reveal that you've been mentally unstable since finding those archives. We'll take the company, we'll take the house, and we'll still crush the girl. You can't win, Silas. The system is designed to protect the Sterlings, not the Vances." Silas looked toward the hallway where Elena was waiting. He realized then that being a king meant nothing if you were a slave to the throne. "You're right," Silas said, picking up a pen. "The system is designed to protect us." He signed the paper. The chairman smiled, reaching for it. But Silas didn't hand it over. He tore it into pieces and threw them into the fireplace. "But I'm not a Sterling anymore," Silas said. "I'm just a man who's tired of living in the dark." He pulled out his phone and hit a button he had prepared. It was a live stream link to every major news outlet in the country. He had set it up the moment he heard the chairman was in the house. "My name is Silas Sterling," he said, speaking directly into the phone's camera, his face broadcast to millions. "And I have a confession to make about the secret at the heart of this company." Behind him, the chairman let out a roar of rage, but it was too late. The invisible Maid secret was invisible no more. The live stream flickered on millions of screens across the globe. From the high-tech trading floors of Manhattan to the quiet living rooms of the Midwest, the Logistics King was no longer delivering a keynote. He was delivering a eulogy for his own reputation. "For 20 years, Sterling Global has been hailed as a titan of innovation," Silas said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in the room behind him. "But today, the truth comes to light. Our core infrastructure, the very system that made us billions, was stolen from a man named Arthur Vance. He died in poverty while we thrived on his genius. And today, his daughter, Elena Vance, is standing in this house, not as a maid, but as the rightful heir to that legacy." The chairman lunged for the phone, but Silas's security team, men who had grown to respect the quiet dignity Elena had brought to the house, stepped in his way. The chairman's face was a mask of purple rage. "You've destroyed us, Silas! You've burned it all to the ground." "No," Silas replied, looking directly into the camera lens. "I'm just clearing the smoke." The immediate aftermath was a firestorm. By noon, Sterling Global's stock hadn't just dipped. It had plummeted into a freefall. The logistics king was being hailed as a hero by some and a traitor by his peers. The European rail partners officially pulled out of the merger, citing ethical instability. Silas was served with a notice of removal by the board within 2 hours. He was given until sunset to vacate the Sterling estate. He found Elena in the library. She wasn't packing. She was standing by the window, watching the swarm of news helicopters circling the mansion, like vultures. "You did it," she whispered as he entered. "You actually did it." "I feel lighter," Silas admitted. He looked around the room, the marble, the rare books, the gold-leafed ceilings. "I'm losing the house, Elena. The board is freezing my personal assets. They're claiming the estate was purchased with company funds and is therefore forfeit." Elena turned to him. "Are you afraid?" "For the first time in my life, no. I spent 38 years being afraid of a shadow. Now that the light is on, the shadow is gone." He walked over to her. "But I've made you a target. The lawyers are already drafting a countersuit against you. They'll try to tie you to the fraud to ensure you never see a dime of restitution." "Let them try," Elena said, a sharp glint in her gray eyes. "I've spent my life surviving with nothing. They don't know how to fight someone who isn't afraid to lose." As the sun began to set, casting a long amber glow over the Atlantic, Silas and Elena walked out of the front doors of the mansion. There was no limousine waiting, no security detail. Just Silas with a single suitcase and Elena with hers. The gates were swarmed with reporters. Flashes blinded them as they stepped onto the public road. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're penniless? Elena, are you the mastermind behind this takedown?" Silas ignored the shouting. He led Elena to a modest 10-year-old sedan parked a block away. It was Elena's car, the one she had used to arrive at the estate as an invisible maid. "Where to, Mr. Sterling?" she asked as they climbed in. "To the only place that matters," Silas said. "To the Vance Protocol." They drove to a small, dusty office in a tech incubator district on the outskirts of Providence. It was a space Silas had rented secretly weeks ago. Inside were 3 young, brilliant engineers who had been fired from Sterling Global for insubordination. They were the ones who had helped Silas verify Arthur Vance's original code. "The board thinks they own the system," Silas said, looking at the glowing monitors in the cramped office. "But they only own the shell, the original heartbeat of the code, the part my father couldn't understand and therefore couldn't steal. Requires the Vance key." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key. It wasn't just a physical object. It was a USB drive encased in an antique shell. She plugged it into the central server. The screen transformed. The cold blue lines of Sterling Global's logistics interface melted away, replaced by a vibrant gold and green map. This was the Vance Protocol. It didn't just track ships and planes. It identified gaps in global food supplies, predicted medicine shortages in war zones, and mapped the most efficient routes for humanitarian aid. Routes that bypassed the profitable ports. "This is my father's dream," Elena whispered. "And now it's our mission," Silas said. "Sterling Global will spend the next 10 years in court fighting over a dying company. Meanwhile, we are going to build the Vance Foundation. We don't need a marble mansion to move the world, Elena. We just need the truth." But the victory was short-lived. That night, a dark car pulled up to the office. A man in a suit Silas recognized all too well stepped out. It was the lead attorney for the board of directors. "Silas," the man said, stepping into the office with a smirk. "Did you really think it would be that easy? The board has just filed a patent infringement injunction. Since you developed this foundation while under contract at Sterling, the Vance protocol belongs to us. We're taking the servers, we're taking the code, and we're taking you both to court for theft of trade secrets." He signaled to two men behind him, who carried a court order. "You can't build a future on a truth that the law says belongs to a corporation," the attorney sneered. Silas looked at the monitors, then at Elena. The logistics king was cornered. The system he had once mastered was now being used to crush the very person he was trying to save. "You're wrong," Elena said, stepping forward. "The law doesn't own the vision. And you've forgotten one very important detail." The attorney's smirk was as cold as the marble floors Silas had left behind. "The law is clear, Elena. You're a Vance, but Silas was a Sterling employee. Anything he touches, the company owns. Hand over the drives." Silas felt the old rage bubbling up, the desire to use his power to crush this man. But Elena placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You're right about the law, Mr. Henderson," Elena said, her voice echoing in the small, cramped office. "But you're wrong about the code. You see, my father knew what kind of man your chairman was. He knew that one day his work might be stolen." She turned back to the monitor. "Silas, the Sterling version of this system, the one the company uses, is a copy. But my father built a dead man's switch into the original architecture. He called it the Shadow Clause." The attorney scoffed. More fairy tales from a failed dreamer. "Is it?" Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard. "For 20 years, Sterling Global has been running on a stolen heart. But that heart was programmed to stop beating if it was ever disconnected from its conscience. By going public today, Silas didn't just confess. He triggered the switch." At that exact moment, the attorney's phone began to scream, with alerts. His face went from smug to ghostly white in seconds. "What is this?" the attorney stammered, staring at his screen. "The global network! It's shutting down. Every Sterling ship, every plane, every warehouse. The tracking is gone. The system is locking everyone out." "It's not gone," Silas said, realizing the brilliance of Arthur's design. "It's just returning to its rightful owner. The Sterling servers are now useless shells. The only place the live code exists is right here, on this drive, under Elena Vance's control." "This is kidnapping a global economy!" Henderson shouted. "No," Silas countered. "It's a repossession. If the board wants their tracking back, they have to sign a full release. They drop the lawsuits, they admit to the theft, and they pay the Vance estate 30 years of backdated royalties. If they don't, by morning, Sterling Global will be a company that doesn't know where its own trucks are parked." The attorney looked at the two disgraced titans and the invisible girl in the dusty office. He knew the board. He knew they cared more about their stock prices than their pride. "They'll sign," the attorney whispered, defeated. He turned and fled into the night. 1 year later, the Sterling estate was no longer a fortress of silence. It had been sold to a luxury hotel chain, the proceeds used to fund the headquarters of the Vance Global Foundation. The new headquarters wasn't a cliffside mansion. It was a renovated warehouse in the heart of the city, a place of glass. But this time the glass was transparent, showing the world the work being done inside. Silas sat in a modest office, his morning coffee now of a normal temperature, shared with the people he worked with. He was no longer the logistics king. He was the chief operating officer of a non-profit that had already saved 50,000 lives by streamlining medical deliveries to rural Africa. There was a knock on the door. Elena walked in. She was no longer wearing a grey uniform. She wore a simple professional suit, but her eyes held the same quiet strength. The first shipment of the Vance Protocol vaccines arrived in the mountains this morning, she said, a smile lighting up her face. On time, every single one. Silas stood up, walking to the window. Below them, the city moved with a frantic energy, but it no longer felt like a chessboard. It felt like a community. You know, Silas said, people still ask me if I regret it, if I miss the marble and the private jets. And what do you tell them? Silas turned to her. He thought of the insomnia that was gone, the heavy box that was no longer in a safe, and the woman who had seen through his shadow. I tell them I spent 38 years being a billionaire who owned nothing, Silas said softly. And now I'm a man who owns his own soul. I think I got the better end of the deal. Elena walked over and stood beside him. They looked out at the horizon together, not as a king and his servant, but as two people who had turned a secret into a legacy. My father would have liked you, Silas, she said. I think he would have just been happy that someone finally turned on the lights, Silas replied. The logistics king and the girl who was once invisible stood in the afternoon sun, watching the world move. Not because they forced it to, but because they had finally given it a way to find its own way home.